Good morning, everyone. My name is Patrick Woody. I'm president of the North Carolina Rural Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar this morning on North Carolina's new small business plan, a pathway to prosperity for all. Just an overview of today's agenda, and we're going to cover a lot of ground in 90 minutes. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of the Rural Center. We're going to look, Jason Gray is going to give us a data snapshot of North Carolina's small businesses. We're going to talk about the findings of the Small Business Policy Task Force and the focus group that completed 6 months worth of work back in the early part of 2021. We're going to spend a little bit of time going over North Carolina's new small business plan. Brandy's going to give us a 2021 legislative update. Miles is going to talk to us about the North Carolina Small Business Coalition, how you can join and participate. And we'll save time for Q&A toward the end and give you plenty of time to ask some questions. A little bit of the mechanics of how this Zoom webinar will work. As you come into the room, all participants are muted. We ask that during the Q&A sections that you submit your questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. The chat function will be disabled. The raise hand function will be disabled. So please enter your questions in the Q&A and we will look through those questions and make sure we deal with as many of them as we can in the time that we have. A little bit about the mission of the Rural Center. So the Rural Center's been around for 34 years and our mission has been consistent across the decades. Our mission is to develop, promote, and implement sound economic strategies to improve the quality of life of rural North Carolinians. We serve the state's 80 rural counties with a special focus on individuals with low to moderate incomes and communities with limited resources. The work of the Rural Center can be divided into 4 big buckets, and I want to spend just a minute touching on each of those. Our engagement work is really reflected through a number of programs at the Rural Center, but this is where our staff is in community across the state, working directly with community leaders on different projects and within different program areas. We partner with Golden Leaf to help bring a stronger tradition and really build a tradition of regional collaboration, getting communities thinking more regionally and acting more regionally to solve our problems. We have a Faith in Rural Communities program that is also focused on the faith community and the role that they play as an important anchor institution in rural communities. Secondly, our leadership work has been really front and center for the Rural Center since day one. We have the flagship Rural Economic Development Institute, which is a 9-day statewide program. Our next Ready Institute comes up at the end of 2021, when we're very hopeful that'll be an in-person training. And we also have a regional-based training called Homegrown Leaders, and I'll talk more about it at the end of our webinar today. Everything we do at the Rural Center is really underpinned by data and research, and all the programs, why we do what we do, how they operate, but also looking at research done by other organizations, other entities to really interpret what that means for rural communities. It is that research, just like in this small business area, that leads to our policy formation and ultimately to our advocacy work. And then finally, small business lending is a big part of what we do at the Rural Center, both direct lending to small businesses and operating programs that support banks, community banks in particular, and CDFIs, or Community Development Financial Institutions. Wanted to keep these 3 brands in front of you as you think about the North Carolina Rural Center. We also want to make sure you're thinking about our 2 subsidiary nonprofits. Thread Capital is a CDFI, a Community Development Financial Institution. We do all of our direct lending from us to a small business through Thread Capital and the great staff that works at Thread Capital. A new subsidiary and a name you're probably not as familiar with, but we'll be hearing a lot more about as time goes on, is Corner Square Community Capital. As we've gone through this pandemic, and certainly as we come out of it and we look at economic recovery, we're more mindful of the importance of community development financial institutions than we've ever been before. Corner Square Community Capital is a partnership between the Rural Center and Truist Bank, established late in the fall of last year, and dedicated to really building the capacity of the CDFI industry throughout the southeastern United States, throughout the footprint of Truist Bank. You'll be hearing a lot more about the work of Corner Square as time goes on. Just a reminder of this state that we live in and that is changing rapidly in ways that in some ways make it unrecognizable to many of us who have been natives of this state and have watched the steady progression of change over the decades. North Carolina still, for all that change, remains a persistently rural state. We have the second largest rural population in the nation with around 4.2 million people. We have the second largest number of small towns with less than 10,000 people in the nation. Only Texas has more rural people. Only Pennsylvania has more small or very small towns than does North Carolina. Our urban centers are less dense and more dispersed than you'll find in a lot of other states. And 26 of the 80 rural counties that we serve are within metropolitan service areas. Metropolitan statistical areas. So that's an important distinction for North Carolina that makes our rural areas more competitive. Also, our rural communities are more dense than you'll find in other states. 80 of the 100 counties in North Carolina are rural, and 415 of the 532 municipalities in North Carolina can be found in those 80 rural counties. And finally, a map of how we look at the state. This is a map that has evolved over 34 years and will continue to evolve after the results of the 2020 census. But you see those green 80 counties, those are the 80 rural counties that we serve. There are 14 of those blue counties, which are regional city or suburban counties. They have population densities greater than 250 per square mile and less than 750. And we currently recognize 6 core urban counties, all with population densities well over 750 per square mile. It's now my pleasure to turn the presentation over to our Senior Fellow for Policy and Research, Jason Gray.
Thank you, Patrick. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you. While I have never watched the TV show, I hear there's a very popular TV show called This Is Us. This data portrait of North Carolina small businesses is sort of a This Is Us portrait. Next slide, please, Miles. So most of the data I'm going to be sharing with you comes from the United States Census Bureau. Okay? And they use 2 major groupings of small businesses in the United States and in the state of North Carolina. One is non-employer firms, which is sort of an offhand way of saying these are just businesses, proprietor owned and run businesses. They have no employees other than the owner. Then there are employer firms. These are firms that have, as it states, employees, and the availability of data for these classifications differ a little bit. We tend to have a little bit richer set of data to work with for the employer firms. Next slide, please. So for the non-employer firms, the self-employed, the proprietorship businesses, The most recent data, census data we have is from 2018. There are over 727,000 such businesses in North Carolina. And we know that their collective economic impact in terms of sales is over $34 billion. So a lot of small self-employed firms, proprietor firms, but not an insignificant economic impact. So we don't have a very good picture of their realities at the state level, but we can say this nationally, is that the national data suggests that these firms generally have less than $100,000 in annual revenue. They have less financial strength, and they use more personal funds to finance their operations. Many of these are startups, but a good number of others have been around a while. But we consider these firms very important because they're the seedbed of entrepreneurship. Identify those firms that can grow over time and have continued impact in the state. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's discuss employer firms. In 2017, which is the most recent data we have, there were 166,609 employer firms. And these employer firms, then the Census Bureau breaks out into two classifications: those that are classifiable and then those that are unclassifiable. And classifiable generally means is that the census data was able to identify ownership data for those firms. Unclassifiable firms, they could not get that. And our interpretation is that generally they're much larger firms, so they may be publicly owned firms. But for the classifiable firms, we have 156,000 of them in the state. This is 94% of all the employer firms. Smaller number, 10,317 unclassifiable firms. So the majority of the employer firms, we can identify ownership patterns. Next slide, please. Next slide. There we go. Okay. So here's the demographic breakout for these classifiable employer firms. 56%, 55.6% of the firm ownership are white males, 17.6% white females, 1.9% black male, 1.3% black female, Hispanic 1.9 and 0.9%. So there's a big difference in the number of firms by racial category. I will point out though that the Hispanic male and female firms, while these are smaller numbers, we know nationally that the business formation rate of Latino-owned businesses is very high. They're launching at 3 times the rate of the general population, according to some national statistics. For North Carolina, we know that the third largest growth, some 54% of Latino-owned businesses in the nation. So we're seeing a pretty high business formation rate even here in North Carolina. But the vast majority of the firms remain white-owned. Next slide. And this is just the tailing side for American Indian male and female businesses. Again, a small number. They're very much a smaller part of the state population, and so it reflects in the business statistics. Next slide. So, looking at how we talk about small businesses is an important topic. The Small Business Administration identifies a small business as any firm that has fewer than 500 employees. This is a broad definition that can lead to diffuse impact for policy purposes. An example from all sorts of ends of the scale. We think this is much too big. deflects resources and attention from where it's needed most. I will just add, and we'll see some statistics here in a little bit, the rapid response loan program that the Rural Center and a coalition of CDFIs around the state has managed through the pandemic. The vast majority of our loans went to firms with less than 10 employees. So we tend to focus on the much smaller side of the scale. Next slide, please. So we often think about small businesses by their size, but one of the big learnings I've had from working with the Small Business Policy Task Force and our partnership with the Kauffman Foundation is that it's not just firm size, it's firm age that really matters a great deal, especially in terms of net job growth. So this is national data that comes from the Kauffman Foundation in their really terrific policy report, America's New Business Plan, emphasizes this a great deal. And this might be a little bit harder to see, but this blue line here is firms less than 5 years old. Red, 5 to 9 years, and the lighter gray number is over 10 years of age. And what we see, this is from, I think, 2000 up to 2018, is that consistently, it's the younger firms that are creating new jobs. Businesses that are less than 5 years old create nearly all the net new jobs in the American economy, including fueling net new jobs created during economic downturns. I mean, this right here is the Great Recession there in the middle. And you can see that even during the Great Recession from late 2007 to 2009, the smaller firms were still creating jobs. Not so for the bigger firms. Next slide. So I found this data very compelling. So I looked at the Bureau of Labor Statistics data for North Carolina for this to see how it matched up, and it looks very similar. Again, very high net job creation by younger firms through the early 2000s, 2008. Again, the decline generally that we see were the Great Recession, but still a net positive growth even during the Great Recession. And this has continued from 2010 going forward. So there's these young firms that are the real engine of net job growth in North Carolina. So this was a big learning for me. I hope it is for you too. Next slide, please. So how are we doing with the pandemic? We've got some good data available through the Census Bureau, who since last April of 2020 have been doing a weekly pulse survey of a sample of small businesses around the country. This chart here is data from the most recent weekly release, which was mid-April 2021. And what we see is that some 67% of the small businesses in North Carolina are experiencing large to moderate impacts. 23% having a very large impact, large negative impact. 44% experiencing moderate impact. I will say that this number has improved considerably since last summer. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see, I put this into a time series. The Census Bureau data allows us time series to review this. And you can see that the top line, that orange line, is the moderate impact in North Carolina over time. There are 3 discontinuity periods where the Census Bureau did not collect data. So that accounts for those gaps, those 3 gaps you see. But what we see over period is generally stable, somewhat declining, moderate impact. The good news is that we've seen a considerable drop in the large negative impact from last spring through this spring. So we're seeing conditions improve a great deal. We still have a ways to go, but we can take hope in the improvements. Next slide. So I want to share with you one data set that just came out recently from a survey that the Federal Reserve System does every year. They do a small business credit survey. And these surveys are generally conducted in the fall of the year. And they released their general small business survey, I think back in January. And then just within the past couple of weeks, released an update that looked more specifically at the conditions in firms owned by people of color. And I just want to highlight just one set of data from this to give a sense of the really the differences in the impact based on the race or ethnicity of the firm owner. Next slide, please. So this is a firms owned by people of color who are more likely than white-owned firms to report their firms experience financial challenges in the last 12 months. And this looks over, four years from 2017 through 2020. Again, this survey was taken last October. And I just want to compare the 2019 value there. And what we see is even pre-pandemic, very large differences in the financial standings of these firms based on the race and ethnicity of their owner. African-American firms consistently have higher financial challenges, even in pre-pandemic. Excuse me. Pre-pandemic, 85% of African-American firms were experiencing some financial distress, 78% for Hispanic firms, 70% for Asian-owned firms, and just 65% for white-owned firms. But for everybody, it skyrocketed during the recession, especially so for the Asian-owned firms. But for African-American firms, 92% of them were reporting financial distress as a result of the pandemic. 89% for Asian, 85% for Hispanic, and 70, can I read my own type there, 79% for white-owned firms. So we see this distress over time. Now, my guess is if we were to take this snapshot again, the Federal Reserve were to take the snapshot again, we would see some improvements here with that. So this is just a reminder, again, as is with so much in society, that how do we create stability and opportunity for those who historically have been on the margins of our economic opportunity in the country. Next slide, please. So I'm going to shift now and share some good news, some wonderful news, really, of how here in North Carolina, the state and a variety of partners have been able to work to help support small businesses during the pandemic. Next slide, please. So the Rural Center, through the Golden Leaf Foundation, the support of the state of North Carolina, and more recently through some of the federal recovery dollars that have flowed into the state. One of the great stories of the Rural Center's history was the creation last year of a rapid response loan program that we did in partnership with the Golden Leaf Foundation. But rather than just the Rural Center do the lending by itself, we created a network with other community development finance institutions across the state. And we had staff working 7 days a week, many of them very long hours with their hair on fire, to create the lending structures to get money on the ground to small businesses to help them make it through the pandemic. So this map and the data I'm sharing, this map was done in January, but we've since had an infusion of some additional capital through the General Assembly and the Golden Leaf Foundation. So I can tell you that right now we have made collectively through all these CDFIs $109 million of loans to over 1,700 small businesses across the state. And certainly now, having preserved and grown over 13,000 jobs. This is a huge accomplishment. And again, it's something that we're very, very proud of. I have amazing colleagues here. Next slide, please. So the other great thing about the rapid response lending program is that we really focused it on where it was really needed. Some 65% of the loans went to historically underutilized businesses. These are businesses that are either female owned or people of color, Hispanic owned businesses. So we've done very, very well by that metric. In terms of loan size, as I mentioned just a while ago, 76% of the loans were made to firms that had less than 9 or under 10 employees. This is really terrific because there's been some criticism of the PPP loan programs, the federal loan programs going to larger businesses. So we've had these quite focused, and we're very pleased with that. Next slide, please. Finally, just looking a little bit more at the demographics of how the loans have gone out. 5.9% of the small businesses in North Carolina are Asian owned. They've received some 7.3% of loans. 3.6% of the firms in North Carolina are African American. Over 21%, almost 22% now, 22.6% from the updated data. Going to African Americans, over 5% went to Latino firms, and then to the rest. So we've worked hard to target these firms, and we're just very happy that we've been able to work with them to get this lending on the ground, to get it to work so they can keep people employed. So that concludes my comments. I know that I've seen a number of questions come in. I wasn't able to follow them and talk at the same time. So we've got a little bit of time here for the questions, and I'm happy to take them. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Miles. And how do we want to go ahead and open up?
Yeah, Jason, there are a couple of questions that came in for you while you were giving your amazing presentation. So I'll just kind of fill those to you now. And what we don't have time for, we'll kind of save to the end just to make sure we can kind of stay on track with the agenda. But first question is a business considered a non-employer firm if its employees are relatives or family members only?
That's a very good question that I don't know the answer to. My guess is no. I would think that family members, if they are, the question is, are they receiving they receiving a paycheck for which taxes then are being paid? If the answer is yes, then I would think they're an employer firm. If not, maybe not. But that's an interesting technical question that I cannot give you a definitive answer on. Contrary to what some of my colleagues think, I don't know everything. Next one.
All right, so next question. Are there statistics for international small business owners, such as those from Yemen owning convenience stores and Vietnam residents starting nail salons? Are there statistics for international small business owners reflected in, I guess, our data, state data?
You know, there is the state data for employer businesses is pretty rich in terms of the racial and ethnic breakdown. But that's at the state level. That data is not available at the county level. But the state level data is very rich in terms of the ethnic composition, whether they're male or female, whether they're veterans. I mean, it's a huge database. So there are likely some insights to be had from the state level data, not so much so at the local level.
Thank you, Jason. Couple more questions, and we're gonna keep going and come back to the rest of these questions at the end, if that's all right with everyone. So next question, I guess based on the racial disparity data that you shared, Jason, are these differences due to the types or classification of the business owned?
Here again, that's a good question. The state level data will break out some of the demographics by the NAICS code, but that is by the business category that they're in. And frankly, we did not go deeply into that data because it's just, I would need a room full of graduate students to help me work through that data. But my guess is yes. I mean, most of the very small businesses tend to be either restaurants, small scale retail type of operations. So that's all I can say on that.
All right. One last question, then we'll get back to the regularly scheduled program, as they say, and try to come back to these questions at the end. So question, Jason, about the 1099 contractors that help qualify as an employee. Are 1099 subcontractors considered employees? Maybe it's a question.
1099 contractors, probably not. Again, I'm not confident to be able to give you a good definitive answer on that.
Got it. No worries.
Those are excellent questions all throughout though.
So a couple of questions, I think, where folks are sort of sharing sort of personal stories, and we may want to wait until I give the legislative update. There could be some opportunities, folks, that could speak to some of the needs around loans and grant programming specifically to address some of your small business needs. So we definitely will get back to these questions after the remainder of the presentation. So Miles, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you, Jason.
All right, thank you, Jason and Brandy, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Miles Kirksey. I'm an advocacy engagement coordinator here at the North Carolina Rural Center. Jason gave us a great overview of what the Rural Center has been doing to get funding to entrepreneurs and small business owners in need over the past year. But what I'm going to talk to you about today is what the Rural Center has been doing in the advocacy space to support small business owners and entrepreneurs across the state. So next slide, please, Jenny. So about 10 months ago now, coming off the real peak of COVID there in 2020, the Rural Center launched the Small Business Policy Task Force with some generous funding from a national entrepreneur organization. We formed the Small Business Policy Task Force with 11 statewide advisors and also 20 members of the task force. It was chaired by 2 co-chairs, one a leading entrepreneur in Western North Carolina, and also a statewide resource provider, business resource provider here in Raleigh. This was a nonpartisan group. We identified these members. They were state policymakers, entrepreneurs, small business owners, and leaders in the entrepreneur space. So we really wanted a lot of diverse perspectives to help inform our efforts and drive the work of the Small Business Policy Task Force. This group was tasked with coming up with state recommendations, bipartisan and nonpartisan recommendations, to help address the challenges faced by entrepreneurs and small business owners on the ground, and also identify opportunities for growth to better support small business owners and entrepreneurs across the state. So this work started about 10 months ago. It's still ongoing, and Brandy will provide you the recommendations that they have landed on with North Carolina's new small business plan here shortly. Next slide, please, Jenny. So from the very onset, the creation of the Small Business Policy Task Force, the Rural Center and the task force wanted to ensure that this work was ground truth, led and informed by entrepreneurs on the ground and community. That was one of the reasons why we identified a lot of folks with entrepreneurship experience to lead the task force, but we also wanted to hear from entrepreneurs on the ground. In September of last year, we hosted 5 regional entrepreneur focus groups across the state. Understanding that different regions across the state have disparities in the challenges that they face, and also demographic differences in the sectors of businesses they have and the resources that are available to them. So we spoke to 55 entrepreneurs across these 5 counties. They gave us a lot of great feedback along the challenges that they were facing around COVID, but also challenges that they had throughout the creation and duration of their business experience. We had a very diverse group of business age ranges and demographic differences amongst these businesses. All these findings are available in our Regional Entrepreneur Focus Group report, which you can find on our website. But we'll get more into the findings here in just a second. Next slide, please, Jenny. So some of our key takeaways from these focus groups, these broke out into 4 pillars, which we then helped guide the 4 pillars of North Carolina's new small business plan. These are opportunity, funding, knowledge, and support. So within opportunity, our entrepreneurs across the state told us that state and federal business incentives felt too tied to job creation numbers. So if you are a small Main Street business in North Carolina, adding 5 to 10 employees felt like a monumental increase to your business, had a huge impact on your own personal business, but also on the community you were serving. A lot of Main Street businesses told them that their Main Street business and their Main Street counterparts were used to often recruit the larger employer firm, the manufacturer, the tech firm, but some of the incentives that made it to these larger employers didn't necessarily trickle down to the Main Street firms. So they felt some of these incentives were too tied to large job creation numbers. From there, I saw a question in the chat regarding this one, and Jason mentioned it as well. The Small Business Administration's general definition for a small business stands at having fewer than 500 employees. A lot of Main Street businesses across the state of North Carolina don't feel this accurately reflected the small business landscape in their community. For a small town to land a 500 employee firm, that's considered a large firm, a large job creator. So they felt this definition needed a little tweaking and maybe a tiered structure. From there, funding, small businesses across the state relied heavily on community banks and CDFIs for both startup and expansion capital. Jason didn't get to this in his presentation, but over the past 10 years, the Rural Center has observed small community banks in rural communities undergoing closures at an increasing rate. What this means is the relationships that small business owners and entrepreneurs rely on for funding aren't often there anymore, and their funding options are becoming more and more limited. They're having to seek out other resources. So community banks and CDFIs are still key when it comes to startup and expansion capital for small businesses. Also, we heard from many entrepreneurs across the state that women and entrepreneurs of color have an increasingly difficult time securing funding compared to their white male counterparts. So that was one key finding in the funding category. Next slide, please, Jenny. All right, within knowledge, we heard this time and time again from entrepreneurs across the state. North Carolina has great resources when it comes to supporting our small business owners and entrepreneurs, whether it's our small business centers, our network of SBTDCs, EDPNC. North Carolina does a really good job providing entry-level support to entrepreneurs, whether it's coming up with a business plan or navigating some of the initial regulations and requirements. What small business owners and entrepreneurs told us they needed more of was some more in-depth, specialized trainings and offerings. These are around shifting economics, so moving to a more e-commerce platform, developing some skills around social media marketing, search engine optimization, and then also some back-end business support. So they thought the resources are great in the state of North Carolina, but would like to see some more expanded offerings from our resource providers. Then also a majority of entrepreneurs reported being either vaguely familiar or uncertain with the requirements and regulations when starting a business. This is often a difficult process for somebody that's never done it before. This ties into our next bullet point here, which if many entrepreneurs in community told us they had more success relying or calling on their neighboring small business to help them navigate that process than they would had they reached out to a resource provider or a local official. So entrepreneur networks, mentoring opportunities were huge in the success of entrepreneurs and small business owners navigating the more difficult processes of getting their business registered. Then under support, health insurance was a huge topic of conversation among our entrepreneurs. This wasn't just around COVID. This is something that folks have been experiencing for the past 5 to 10 years. Many entrepreneurs listed health insurance, both being able to provide it to themselves and their family, and also to their employees as a huge barrier. A lot of small businesses are having trouble recruiting new employees and retaining employees and a skilled workforce if they aren't able to provide healthcare benefits. So health insurance was one of the greatest needs listed by entrepreneurs. From there, tying into the healthcare space, workforce, retaining and recruiting a new trained workforce was a key support needed. Also workforce housing, that's specific to several regions across the state, but we do hear that time and time again. And then also access to high-speed broadband, some of the leading concerns in the support space for entrepreneurs and small business owners. So with that said, we heard all of these findings from entrepreneurs across the state. These help guide our policy recommendations that have made it into North Carolina's new small business plan. So with that, I will turn it over to our Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy, Brandy Bynum-Dawson, for our recommendations.
Yeah, thank you for that, Miles. And I see there's a couple of questions in the chat. And so a couple of the resource providers that Miles mentioned, I mean, the small business centers at the 58 community colleges across the state are a huge resource when it comes to supporting small business owners and developing their small business, identifying opportunities for capital, and providing ongoing coaching and technical assistance. So if you're looking to find a place to get that information, I say the small business centers are definitely one of those places. In addition to EDPNC, a business link, their online sort of portal and referral system, as well as a great resource. Your local areas chambers of commerce are also a great resource to find out what small business are in your community and other ways to find that sort of coaching, TA, and support as well. So just a couple of resources I wanted to name. Next slide. All right, so Jason alluded to this early on in his presentation. We have partnered with the UN Marion Kaufman Foundation out of Kansas on their America's New Small Business Plan. We have since sort of morphed that plan, reconfigured it in a sense to fit a North Carolina context. That's right, and sorry, the SBTDC is also a great resource. Thanks for that reminder. Additionally, we work with the task force over the course of a 6 to 9 month period last summer into early winter of this year to develop what we're calling North Carolina's new small business plan. Miles also ran you all through the focus group findings from the regional focus groups that were held to really allow us to ground truth what task force members were sharing with what actual entrepreneurs were experiencing on the ground. So we wanted to make sure from the very onset, from the very forefront, that we are always making sure that we're ground truthing our information with the folks who are impacted by the issue. So with that, we have developed North Carolina's new small business plan. It's based on 4 pillars, which again are framed after the Kaufman Foundation's America's New Business Plan. Opportunity, ensuring an equitable level playing field and less red tape for entrepreneurs, whether new, existing, or seeking to grow a business. Funding, having equal access to the right kind of capital everywhere. Knowledge to know how to start a business. And support, the ability for all to take a risk. So I'm actually going to walk through the 20 recommendations from the task force's plan, their report, and also give some examples thereafter with legislation that we've been advancing and advocating for as a result of those policy recommendations and other great work that's happening across the state. Next slide. So with that, the opportunity pillar, again, is around an equitable level playing field with less red tape. Miles alluded to a lot of these recommendations in his presentation, but these are sort of the solid recommendations that the task force identified. And where you see the stars, they're designating recommendation that the task force said, we want to prioritize these in the short term, recognizing this is going to be a long-term policy advocacy plan. There are things that we can advocate in the short term to really begin to move the needle for our state's entrepreneurs and small business owners. So first up is the opportunity to increase funding and coordination of TA services and assistance for rural communities, for them to be able to nurture and grow small business development and downtown revitalization. Some examples of those types of entities are your chambers of commerces, your community development corporations as well. So spurring additional funding and infusion of funding to those entities to continue to provide the TA that they do on a daily and regular basis. Next up, Jason alluded to this in his data as well. We have a growing population, growing Latino population here in our state. We need to ensure that we are providing bilingual and bicultural services, technical assistance services, that is, throughout our entrepreneur ecosystem, through our SBCs, the SBTDCs, the CDFIs, and all the other entrepreneur support ecosystem partners across the state. So ensuring that everyone has a chance to participate and to contribute and get the services they need to be able to spur small business growth in our state. Next up, the next two recommendations speak to our state hub office or the historically underutilized business office and their opportunities to further develop and diversify their programming to ensure that more business owners of color and more business owned by women actually have access to contracting and procurement opportunities in the state and also at the federal level as well. This leads to the opportunity to also expand the reach and capacity of the state hub office for them to be able to support folks more locally and on the ground. So supporting their capacity to do what they do on a daily basis and expand their service delivery. Next slide. Funding. All right, so this is around the equal access to the right kind of capital everywhere. First recommendation in this pillar area is opportunity for North Carolina to enact a Small Business Truth in Lending or Financing Act in hopes of promoting greater transparency by non-banking lending institutions at the state level, especially during times of natural disasters and other crises. So we want to ensure there's transparency in loan terms, pricing terms, APRs, so that small business owners who are seeking funding by these non-banking lending institutions have the right information to be able to compare, as we say, apples to apples across financing products and make the best decisions available to them. So the next pillar is, again, the acknowledgement that we have a growing body of entrepreneur ecosystem financiers that are supporting the smallest loans to the smallest small businesses across the state. We need to ensure that they are able to do their jobs by providing additional capacity, supports through financing to those institutions, like your CDFIs, for example. Again, the following recommendation is a direct potential allocation that we are advocating for recurring funding to our CDFI network across the state, specifically the 9 or so CDFIs that conduct or provide small business lending directly. So we need to build their capacity, support their operations to better support small business owners across the state. The next recommendation is a federal recommendation, so to speak, and we'll talk about kind of what has happened since we've been advocating for this, and us along with a number of partners across the nation for that matter. So encouraging Congress to reauthorize the state small business credit initiative to support a sustainable and resilient small business sector. I'll talk about that recommendation more specifically because it has happened. So I'll talk about that a little bit more detail. Next slide. All right, so this next recommendation speaks to a program here in North Carolina called the One North Carolina Small Business Program, which really is a program that seeks to spur innovation in the research and tech areas across the state for small businesses seeking federal grants through 2 programs. So we're advocating for additional funding, recurring funding specifically to that program to allow the reactivation of their matching grant program and the further expansion of the other program to better support growth across rural businesses across the state and to further diversify participation of businesses, small businesses across the state as well into those federal opportunities. Jason and Miles alluded to this very clearly early on, is that the SBA definition of a small business is broad, it's robust, and particularly as we look at the other end of the spectrum and how we define a small business, those with under 150 employees or even fewer, under 10 employees, that we need to be ensuring that through incentives and contracting, through government opportunities, that they have access to those same type of opportunities financially, also contractually as well. So looking at opportunities to redefine, so to speak, a North Carolina definition of a small business in our state. Next recommendation speaks to the opportunities around existing incentive-based programs and potentially new ones to have specific and special carve-outs for small and micro businesses, and particularly those that are hub businesses, so historically underutilized businesses, to ensure entrepreneurship efforts and small business formation, especially in rural areas of the state. And the JDIG is just one example of that opportunity potentially. Next slide. So the knowledge pillar really speaks to the know-how for folks to take a risk. So what are the opportunities to ensure people have the right information at the right time and the right resources and support to develop their expansion of a business or them even starting a business? So one of those examples is a program out of East Carolina University, their School of Business, called Accelerate Rural North Carolina. We're looking at that program for potential statewide replication as well, as an online mentoring model where you're connecting entrepreneurs, emerging entrepreneurs with seasoned entrepreneurs for them to learn how to grow their business, start their business, how to gain access to capital, investments, business portfolio, you kind of name it. So this is a really specific model that connects entrepreneurs with seasoned entrepreneurs to help them sort of pilot and model their programming. The next recommendation speaks to, again, an issue that Miles shared that came from our focus group participants, which is there's a lot of, I would say, confusion of sorts when it comes to starting a business and knowing kind of where to go, where to start. What are the regulatory issues and forms that I need to complete to start a business, whether at a local level, municipal, state, or even federal level. And so the task force came up with this recommendation, which is to advocate for a state ombudsman's office that has a regional presence that would basically serve as a regulatory navigator body of sorts to help small business owners navigate and troubleshoot, issues around regulatory compliance, but also serve as an advocacy body to help improve make those regulatory navigation a bit easier. So really looking to address regulatory issues, compliance issues, and concerns. The next recommendation speaks to, and I've already sort of given them off as example, is the opportunity to expand the capacity and reach of our state small business center office and the local networks at each of our 58 community colleges. So that is another opportunity for us to expand the outreach and opportunities for small business owners to have the resources at their disposal by expanding the capacity and the reach of our small business centers across the state. Next slide. Again, knowledge to know how to take a risk. Another issue that Miles addressed or brought up as far as the focus group findings is that, again, something I've already mentioned, which is small business owners describing the concern and issue around not really knowing where to go to get different pieces of information, recognizing that while we have a significant and a robust small business entrepreneur ecosystem across the state, that people aren't really sure where to go specifically, right? And so the idea of the opportunity to create a online, centralized, app-based resource portal that helps not only small business owners, but also resource providers kind of navigate how to better assist and coordinate the delivery of services across the spectrum. The next recommendation speaks to the opportunity that if we're going to talk about growing entrepreneurs, we probably should start earlier, right? There's also existing programming in our state through our career and technical education program, and specifically supporting the teachers and coordinators of that program for them to grow their professional development to better support these innovations and opportunities for middle and high schoolers to grow their entrepreneurship wing, so to speak. Next slide. And then last but not least is a support pillar, which is the opportunity and ability for all to take risks. So Miles has already alluded to this. Where you see the 2 stars are 2 really big issues where not just the task force members, who were also focus group participants, they were not quiet about what the concerns and issues were there. So an opportunity for North Carolina to address in a very holistic way, this what we're calling the health insurance coverage gap, particularly for small business owners, their employees, and their families. So we want folks to join the entrepreneurship space or stay in that space, ensure that they can afford and have access to affordable, high-quality health insurance. The next 2 recommendations really speak to what we've seen in this sort of issues around the pandemic specifically, and the opportunity for North Carolina to take another look at our unemployment insurance system and see if there are opportunities for us to overhaul, re-reform, so to speak, but expand opportunities for folks to have access to supports when it comes to our unemployment system for an equal amount of time and also for ensure there are adequate benefits provided. And the last but not least recommendation in this sort of pillar area is around broadband. I think we all in this call, whether you're in urban, suburban, or rural, can kind of speak to the issues around the lack of access to reliable, high quality broadband, and not for the lack of trying, right? And so we know that across the state, there are huge unserved and underserved areas continuously when it comes to broadband access. And I will speak to a number of legislation that's seeking to sort of meet that need and address that gap. Next slide. So with that, we'll sort of take you into a very brief, high-level overview of opportunities at both the federal and the state level when it comes to policy and legislation. So you'll note that of some of these bills and legislation I'm going to speak to and acts so to speak, that some of them have been put into law. Others are still on the table. So opportunities for you to lend your voice to these issues and to these debates. Next slide. So I'll start at the federal level with the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. As you all know, on March 11th, 2021, President Biden signed that legislation, which is the American Rescue Plan Act. This is a $1.9 trillion stimulus bill, and there's $50 billion in that seeks to aid small businesses through loans, grants, and other programs. Now, I am just sort of overviewing just a few of those grant programs and loan programs, for example. You'll definitely need to take a look at the act to get the additional detail and opportunities for what the other funding sources are there. So first up, as I mentioned, as one of the task force's recommendation was our advocacy around the reauthorization of the state small business credit initiative. Well, that happened by way of the ARPA. And so what that means is that there will be soon to be a $10 billion infusion to fund states, territories, and tribal governments for new or existing small business access to capital programs. And what that means for North Carolina is we're expecting an infusion of $120 million to keep that program, maintain that program, and grow that program even further over the next couple of years to come. Next up are, as you all know, the Paycheck Protection Program, but specifically modifications to the program to ensure that social and economic advantaged small business owners have access to the program, but also expanding the definition of an eligible entity to nonprofits as well. So there's greater detail in the full act, but that was a dedicated $7.2 billion to the modified Paycheck Protection Program loan. Next up is the Restaurant Revitalization Fund. We all can definitely speak to, I think, opportunities and issues around how the pandemic impacted a number of small business, particularly restaurants and bars and hubs and places that really serve food and beverages. So this Restaurant Revitalization Fund really does seek to establish a grant program to support those entities that provide and serve food or drink. These are grants that may be used for eligible expenses like payroll, mortgage, rent, utilities, kind of all the sort of issues and concerns that we know that our small business owners have had to address. The next program is the Community Navigator Pilot Program. Again, $170 million was allocated to establish this program. Really, it's more of an outreach program of sorts to ensure that small business owners who lack access to the information about the other programs are actually going to be able to get that information through other partners. So there are grants awarded to a number of organizations for them to do just that. Let everybody know what relief programs are out there and how they can apply for those and supporting people in doing so. The next item there is the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant Program. Again, you all know, speaking to live venues across the state and across the nation, this is at $1.25 billion for that program, specifically to address the needs of your museum owners, your motion pictures, your live performance and arts programs and organizations, to really support them in getting back on their feet. Some of the same sort of eligibility requirements or usage of the funds around payroll, utilities, and mortgage was also applicable to this program as well. Next slide. So next I'll launch into broadband again by way of the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. Again, as you all know, in totality, $1.9 trillion for the ARPA, but specifically where we've been able to pinpoint, really specifically, $362 billion for state and local municipalities, but also tribal governments as well, to use these funds for specific reasons by investing in expansion of broadband services. So these are just a handful of the programs we were actually specifically able to narrow down where states and localities and tribal governments are allowed to use funds to address broadband, whether infrastructure of deployment, whether affordability or accessibility or adoption as well. So very sort of broad opportunities for utilizing funds, but a chance to really address broadband really holistically and specifically at a local level. Next slide. So now I'll sort of highlight, again, brief highlight of some of the opportunities at the state level. So just one caveat to this data, or what I'm about to share as far as some of the highlights regarding legislation, is just last week, what were called Bill Crossover Week. So this is the point at which most bills must pass at least one chamber of the General Assembly for it to potentially become law of the session. So just a couple bit of data for you all to have. House members, meaning members of the House of Representatives, filed 960 bills by the end of last week, and senators filed 720 just last week. The House passed 336 bills by the crossover deadline, and a little more than third, meaning the Senate passed about 156 by that time as well. So just wanted to give you all a sense of how busy the last week was, definitely down on Jones Street, but also how much was able to get done and where the additional opportunities for advocacy are. So I'll start with, again, what you'll note from some of the recommendations that were shared by way of the task force's recommendations. You'll find that I'll be highlighting those. You'll find that I'll be highlighting those by way of some of these legislative updates. So specifically starting with the first bill here, Senate Bill 494 and House Bill 965, which is an opportunity for us to enhance and modify the One North Carolina Small Business Program. So that is one of the recommendations straight from the task force, came by way of both the governor's initial budget proposal, but also two pieces of legislation. So right now, that bill is sitting in the Senate Appropriations Committee, and also the House bill is sitting in the House Appropriations. So that's an opportunity for advocacy. The Rural Center will probably issue an action alert, so stay tuned for your opportunity to advocate for that program specifically. Next up is the Small Business Truth in Financing Act. You heard me mention that earlier in the recommendations section, which was the Small Business Truth in Lending Act. Same thing, same opportunity, but now it's an actual piece of legislation. So House Bill 969. Again, what we're seeking right now, this legislation, quite honestly, the purpose of it is to ensure that small business owners who are seeking these opportunities for these type of financing products know what they're purchasing, know what they're getting themselves into, rather. So we want that there be full disclosure and transparency by these institutions. So that bill has been referred to the House Commerce Committee. We have yet to know when it will be calendared, but we'll definitely let you all know, as that'll be a huge opportunity for advocacy. Next up is the Local Food Market Expansion Act. This act really speaks to providing a grants program for small farmers, particularly disadvantaged farmers, those are socially and economically disadvantaged, for them to have a pot of funds to support them in becoming GAP certified. So GAP certification really is the programming that seeks to ensure that there is no sort of cross-contamination between products when seeking to procure those products and also sell those products in the marketplace. So this is a great piece of legislation. This next legislation is about sort of the PPP program, but also an opportunity to ensure that those loans that were received the first go round are not subject to also state income tax for tax year 2020. That bill has been sitting in the Senate Finance Committee. We'll see if it ever makes the light of day, but the bill did pass the House and it's been sitting in the Senate, I think, for the last month. So we'll see if that comes to fruition. Next slide, Jenny. So I'm going to kind of highlight some of these as well. So the Employee Benefits Plan, so Senate Bill 228, this definitely speaks to an issue that you saw the task force mention, which is, or highlight rather, which is around this opportunity for greater access to health insurance for small business owners, their families, and their employees. So this legislation hopefully seeks to specifically address that. That bill passed the Senate and is currently in the House Rules Committee. So a great opportunity for advocacy to support the opportunities for businesses to offer exclusive health insurance benefits to their employees. Next slide. So broadband. So I cannot tell you all how many broadband bills have been introduced this legislative session. We're actually going to do a deeper dive and an analysis of said legislation to be able to kind of share out with our constituency exactly what those pieces of legislation are. I've sort of picked a handful of them just to kind of highlight. Some of them actually were just introduced last week to meet the crossover deadline. I think, for example, the first three actually were just introduced last week. So a lot of the broadband bills are seeking to either one, expand the GRATE program, which is a grant program that allows for better deployment of broadband across the state by allowing ISPs to apply for those funds. So there's tons of bills that are actually advocating for proposing rather for greater expansion, additional funding and capacity for that GRATE program to continue. Again, most of the bills are seeking to address this connection between opportunities around fixed wireless, satellite wireless, and fiber wireless as well. So again, increasing opportunities for unserved and underserved areas to gain access through a number of different ways. Senate Bill 517 at the bottom that you'll see there. Again, there's a lot in that particular piece of legislation seeking to address a number of different sort of barriers and nuances when it comes to increasing broadband access across the state. That first bullet in that last piece of legislation, Senate Bill 517, is really, number one, seeking to ensure we have accurate mapping. So knowing exactly where the unserved and underserved areas are across the state to better deploy resources, whether the actual infrastructure, but also seeking to address the issues around affordability and adoption rates. So because it's available, can people also afford it? So what, the subsidies and sort of incentivizing programming that way, but also the digital literacy component as well. So ensuring that people have access to the appropriate technology to utilize the services, and then also ensuring that they are able to have what they need to support them and better utilizing those same services. Next slide. All right, so the health pillar, again, is another huge one that the task force identified recommendation-wise. There are three specific pieces of legislation I wanted to bring to y'all's attention today. One is House Bill 149, which is a quote unquote kind of blanket telehealth bill. So one, ensuring that telehealth is reimbursed, basically ensuring that telehealth is reimbursed at the same rate that in-person health is reimbursed at. So that way that it makes it more likely for telehealth providers across the state to be able to provide those services more readily and more accessibly across the state of North Carolina. That second bill, House Bill 144, again, seeks to really expand the capacity and reach, so to speak, and practicing within their scope of practice, so to speak, for dentists or dental hygienists. So allowing them to do so under direct supervision of a licensed dentist, but again, expanding their scope of practice in that right. So that bill has made its way through the House and has been referred to the Senate Rules Committee. And then last but not least in the health section is the SAVED Act, which is another bill quite similar to the teledentistry bill that really seeks to expand the scope of practice for advanced practice registered nurses to allow them to practice within the full scope of their license by removing any requirements for them to be supervised by a licensed physician. That bill has passed first reading in both the House and the Senate, and has been referred to the Rules Committee on both the House and the Senate side. So we'll continue to watch that bill and monitor that bill very closely and keep you guys abreast. Next slide. Speaking of keeping you all abreast, there are a number of ways for us to be able to do that. If you are not signed up for all things Rural Counts, we encourage you to do that. I think they'll probably drop the link somewhere in the chat, or we'll definitely send it by way of our follow-up email. But we actually have a number of different ways for you all to stay engaged and have the information almost as equally and as readily as we do. So number one is our legislative tracker. So we literally track hundreds of bills that come through the General Assembly on a given year. And so that's a way for you to track specific legislation to a specific topic or issue that you're concerned about, like broadband or health or housing. You're able to filter on our website and track specific piece of legislation and find out the status of the bill, to also know the opportunities for you all to advocate. We also, during legislative session, issue a weekly legislative update, which is literally sort of a rundown of what happened on Jones Street that week. We also use an opportunity to provide an update on a federal policy as well, and also a little bit of sort of news and resources, maybe around grant opportunities or other funding opportunities that you might find useful. So that's another way. Next slide. We also have a bi-monthly newsletter. So every other month we issue what we call a much more in-depth sort of look at Rural Counts issues, also our programming. We provide both a state policy update, a federal policy update. If there are any funding opportunities around issues that are part of our Rural Counts priority platform, we also share that information as well. And then, as I've alluded to a couple of times, is that we will begin, and we have done before, issuing action alerts. These are opportunities for you to specifically engage your elected officials, your state legislators specifically, on specific piece of legislation. So you will hear from us very soon, if you're on our listserv, about opportunities for you to engage directly with your elected leaders in Raleigh. Next slide. All right, and now I'll hand it over to Miles to talk about a very specific and interesting and unique way for you all to engage around small business policy issues.
Yes, and I know we had some great questions coming in through the chat, so Brandy will get to those here shortly, guys. But to talk about North Carolina's Small Business Coalition, this coalition was launched in March along with North Carolina's new small business plan that Brandy just presented. I hope a lot of those recommendations resonated with you guys. Judging by the chat, it looks like we have a lot of entrepreneurs and small business owners on this call. Also, based off registration, a lot of small business resource providers. So that said, I'm pretty confident in saying a lot of you guys are small business advocates and advocates of small business and entrepreneurship across the state. So with that, the North Carolina Rural Center has launched a statewide small business coalition. This coalition is going to be guided by 4 pillars. The first one being engagement. Throughout this process, we've made sure that Main Street entrepreneurs had a voice, and we want to elevate that voice and give it weight here on Jones Street in Raleigh. So we want to continue to have this effort guided and informed by entrepreneurs, small business resource providers, and advocates on the ground. So with the Small Business Coalition, there will be engagement opportunities, surveys, future focus groups to ensure the work of our advocacy program and also the Rural Center's programmatic focuses are best serving entrepreneurs and small business owners on the ground. From there, we'll also have a big policy focus. So identifying both state and federal legislation, a lot of the pieces of legislation Brandy just talked about, but other pieces of legislation that develop in next session and following sessions that help address the needs of existing small business owners and entrepreneurs across the state, and also help create pathways for future entrepreneurs. So we will be keeping a close eye on policy and legislations and making sure that small business advocates are familiar and able to advocate for a lot of those policies. Building off of that, we'll also be involved in the advocacy space. So we've heard from entrepreneurs and small business owners a need for them to advocate for themselves with their state policymakers, elected officials, and also on a federal level. We want to ensure that you guys have the tools, resources, data, and information you need to do that. Part of this will be the Rural Center providing you guys action alerts, as Brandy mentioned, around timely legislation that is moving. But on a longer term level, we want to make sure that those resources make it to you. You feel confident reaching out and contacting your elected officials and advocating for the most pressing needs and challenges that you're seeing on the ground. From there, the last pillar is resources, very, very important pillar. We've already talked about it. North Carolina has great resources in the small business space. There's a lot of federal resources as well right now coming out addressing the needs of small business owners. The Rural Center wants to do a good job collecting these resources and making sure they make it to the folks that need these most. So these are developing a catalog of timely resources, sharing these out with coalition members, and making sure that entrepreneurs and small business owners on the ground are familiar with them. Educational opportunities, funding, workshops, data, news, and more. We want to make sure this makes it to the folks that need them most. Next slide, please, Jenny. So the Small Business Coalition so far, we've got 187 signatories across the state. One thing that's really surprised us, but really kind of makes us reassured in our work, is that over half of the folks that have signed on to the Small Business Coalition are entrepreneurs and small business owners. It looks like there's a lot of folks on the call that fit this category as well. So that means that the recommendations that have made it into our North Carolina new small business plan, and also a lot of the work that we've done along the way is resonating on the ground across North Carolina. So it is reassuring that 120 out of these 187 are small business owners and entrepreneurs. We're going to continue to do our best to engage these folks and make sure they have a say in where this effort and where this work continues to head. Right now, we've got 61 counties represented. You'll see those in the green here. If you're on this call today and see your county in gray, we'd love you to sign on to the coalition. We'll give you a link here in a second. But we'd like to make this whole 100 county effort. We're on our way to do that. And we'll continue to do outreach across the state and provide the data and news that you guys need to feel able to participate in the Small Business Coalition. Next slide, please, Jenny. So this is our ask of you guys today. North Carolina's new Small Business Coalition, how to get involved. One, we'd like you to endorse North Carolina's new small business plan. The recommendations in the plan, we hope those resonated with you. We hope ground truthing these across the state has gotten us to a point where we feel confident that these will have an impact on small business owners and entrepreneurs. We'd like you to endorse these by signing on to our coalition. The link there below, bit.ly/smallbizcoalition. We'll also put that in the chat. Also, we understand that you guys have great connections across the state with the entrepreneur small business community in your own region and area. We'd like you to share these recommendations with your networks. We want to make sure to expand these networks to underrepresented, underserved populations that may not be familiar with them. We want to make sure these resources make it to those folks and they can continue to receive information as part of this coalition. So we'll be recruiting participation of local entrepreneurs and support organizations across the state. From there, as some of the legislation Brandy discussed continues to move, we'll be urging a lot of entrepreneurs, small business advocates to contact your legislators. You guys have a huge voice and a huge impact as economic drivers of rural North Carolina. So reaching out to your legislators can help move legislation, and we want to provide those opportunities to you all. From there, social media is a great way to engage. The Rural Center has two great social media pages, both the Rural Counts and Rural Center social medias. Please keep an eye on those. We'll make sure timely pieces of legislation, action alerts, newsletters get posted on there. Also news and resources. So keep an eye on those. You'll be able to engage via social media and also through our newsletter. And then the last piece, probably the most important piece, share your feedback with the Rural Counts team. This isn't a one-year effort. This is not a two-year effort. This is a long-term effort of the North Carolina Rural Center supporting entrepreneurs and small business owners. We want to continue to receive your feedback to make sure that we are best addressing the most pressing needs and concerns of entrepreneurs and small business owners on the ground. So don't hesitate to shoot us an email, pick up the phone and call us. We'd love to hear feedback and want to make sure that y'all's voices are continued to be heard throughout this conversation. Next slide, please, Jenny. All right, and I think we've got some great questions, so I'll turn it back over to Brandy, and hopefully we're able to get to all of them.
Yeah, let's see how many we can get to in this amount of time and make sure that we get folks out on time. So with that, Miles, I think one of the last questions is, can you drop the coalition link in the chat? Yes, we can. We want as many folks as possible to sign up to join the North Carolina Small Business Coalition, so we'll drop that into the chat. Couple other questions. So yes, we will also send out by way of our follow-up email a PDF of the report, North Carolina's new small business plan. We can also send you the focus group findings as well, which I think are equally as critical and important for you all to have. So we'll share that out as well. So there are a couple of questions about resources. So I'm glad we were naming some of the key sort of institutional partners in the entrepreneur ecosystem space. So also by way of the follow-up email, we can send you all links to information about the SBTDC, EDPNC's Business Link North Carolina, the SBCs across the state, and probably also a number of CDFIs as well. So we will also send that to you all by way of a follow-up email. We have actually created an infographic which details how you start a business, what are the barriers to starting a business, potentially in North Carolina, which also includes a plethora of resources on how you can get support on technical assistance, coaching, and funding throughout your development process of starting and growing a business in the state. Jason, I believe there are a couple other questions, data questions. So I want to kind of pitch those back to you. So I think those are questions specifically to the North Carolina Rapid Recovery Loan Program. A question about the data on the 8,111 businesses who declined or withdrew their applications from the Rapid Recovery Loan Program. Do we know much about those businesses and why that may have been the case?
I can say that that a good portion of them happened a year ago this spring, when the Rapid Response Loan Program was launched, and there were a number of other loan products coming out at the same time, the EIDP loans, the PPP loans. And my recollection is that Thread staff were saying that a lot of people were applying for a lot of different programs because everybody was panicked. The need was there, businesses were shutting down, and that a number of the applicants had either found lending from elsewhere, or that they decided not to go for a loan at all, or just altogether shut down their business. Now, a certain percentage of them, of course, are applicants who have the same problems that they would have going elsewhere, is that, either limited capital or other kind of restrictions. And I can't really speak to those, but I do know that the Thread staff commented significantly that that out of the panic of businesses shutting down in March and April of 2020, when the pandemic really began to hit, people were applying for everything in a panic, and that and that accounts for a good number of those, I think.
Thank you, Jason. So I'm looking at the chat and also the Q&A. There are some very specific questions that I think folks are looking to for support around developing certain innovations for their small businesses. So we'll definitely share out the resources for the types of folks and providers that can support you all in doing so. Again, I think the SBCs, the SBTDC, EDPNC, some of the area CDFIs as well. So we'll definitely be sure to share that with you all by way of a follow-up email. Trying to see if there are other questions. Are there other questions in the chat or the Q&A that I've missed?
And I'll add, Brady, I've seen quite a few questions come in about resources across the state. We will share those out in a document following this and try to connect you guys with your local small business center, SBTDC, et cetera.
Other questions? I think we got them all. We will definitely get into Miles's point, share those resources out. They're plentiful. We want to make sure that folks have what they need to grow and to start their businesses. So we'll definitely share that out. Don't want to cut off the Q&A, so I'm still looking to see if there's anything else we may have missed. All right, it looks like we got them all. So if you do have a question, don't hesitate to drop it in the chat. If we have a minute, we'll definitely try to get to it. All right, next slide, Jenny.
Okay, that's my cue. So thank you, Brandy, Miles, Jason. Great job covering a lot of ground in a short amount of time. Thank you for that. As I mentioned, as I was overviewing the Rural Center, we have been operating over the last 3 years a regional leadership development program. It's really focused intensely on building the leadership capacity within rural regions of our state. We call it Homegrown Leaders. We did a series that was focused on Western North Carolina. We have 5 different programs across the western part of the state. Now we're focused on Eastern North Carolina. We have delivered 2 trainings virtually during the pandemic, and I'm happy to say this is our 3rd training for Eastern North Carolina. That will be coming up in July. It will be an in-person training held in New Bern, North Carolina, over a 3-day period. If you are already an active leader in these counties that are listed here, or an emerging leader, or someone that's looking to get much more engaged in your community, we invite you to apply to participate in this training. So we'll be focused on Beaufort, Bertie, Carteret, Craven, Greene, Lenoir, Pamlico, and Pitt counties on this training on July 20th and 22nd. If your counties aren't listed there, stay tuned. We will eventually get to you. It takes a while to get around this big state, about 3 or 4 years it will take us to get around the entire state. We're happy to be focused on the East right now, and we are absolutely delighted that our next training will be in person in New Bern, July 20th and 26th through the 22nd. Thank y'all.
Thank you, Patrick. I did know there was another question in the chat that I did not get to, but I since found that information. So it's a question about if there was a bill that we were aware of that was also seeking to expand scope of practice for physician assistants. I haven't found that specifically, though I did find one that was really around expanding scope of practice, but when it comes to prescribing a targeted controlled substance. So we'll definitely follow up with that individual who asked that question in the chat to get more information. So I just want to acknowledge that was one question that I want to make sure that we got to. All right, so we gave you a lot of information today. We don't want you to hesitate to reach out to us. Again, be sure to sign up for all things Rural Center, all things Rural Counts, which I'm assuming you have since you were here today with us on today's webinar. But be sure to follow us, our legislative actions and activities, opportunities for you to stay as timely and as abreast of issues that are impacting our state, and also opportunities for you to lend your voice. And please, please, please join the North Carolina Small Business Coalition, share it with your networks, and encourage others to do the same. We thank you all very much for your time with us today. And again, don't hesitate to reach out to the Rural Center. We're glad you were able to join us. Thank you for your time.